Very interesting stories coming out of Impact Wrestling in the last couple of hours, specifically from Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Now, there obviously have been a lot of reports that the last batch of Impact Wrestling TV tapings carries the company up to the Hard to Kill pay-per-view that's in January. But what is coming out now, according to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, is now a discussion about Impact Wrestling's testing policies and procedures, or quite frankly, a lack of it, throughout the entirety of the ongoing pandemic so far. Now, according to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, there was a positive COVID-19 test at the last set of Impact Wrestling tapings in Nashville, Tennessee at Skyway Studios. Now, as I mentioned, these most recent tapings carries the company to the Hard to Kill pay-per-view in January, but according to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, there was a positive COVID-19 test at these recent Impact Wrestling tapings for AXS TV. Now, Meltzer is reporting that very few wrestlers were notified, but others were not notified at all, and those who were not notified of this positive COVID-19 test were, quote, very hot and not finding out directly from management that there was a positive test on the roster. Now, the Wrestling Observer newsletter is reporting that, as I mentioned, few Impact wrestlers were notified that they needed to get checked out due to this positive test. But even when they were notified of this positive test, they weren't even told who the wrestler or person backstage at Impact Wrestling who had tested positive was. And on the other side of things, there were a huge amount of people in the company that were not notified of this positive test. Now, according to the report, the wrestler who tested positive was believed to be part of a group of several people that traveled together to the Impact Wrestling tapings and are tight with each other, obviously being in close proximity of each other, therefore requiring a test due to the contact tracing system that should be in place. Now, the report states that Impact has only, now I must stress this is how crazy this story is, Impact has only been doing temperature checks and not testing as they've run shows during the pandemic. You have to remember, Impact Wrestling pretty much hasn't missed a single show or broadcast during the pandemic ever since April, March, February, whenever this craziness started. But Impact has not been doing full-blown testing. They have only been doing temperature checks. Now, one wrestler noted to Meltzer that it was, quote, very irresponsible of Impact to be the only major professional wrestling company to not be doing testing. WWE began doing testing following multiple positive tests in June, while AEW has been consistently testing ever since the pandemic began. Promotions like Major League Wrestling and Ring of Honor shut down and went on hiatus for months before starting up again with bulk tapings and, of course, official COVID testing, thorough COVID testing, so much so that MLW was actually widely praised by all of the wrestlers that competed at the recent MLW restart tapings for Fusion, saying how safe and how thorough the testing was. Now, on the flip side of things, Impact, as I mentioned, they've been doing no testing. They've just been doing temperature checks. And during this whole time, Impact has been doing bulk tapings at Skyway Studios in Nashville, Tennessee during this COVID-19 pandemic, and has continued to run its weekly television show on AXS TV, in addition to holding pay-per-views and Impact Plus special events. Now, one wrestler noted to the Observer that most of the wrestlers, as I mentioned, were not told about this positive COVID test and were very upset having to hear the news through backstage gossip that someone had tested positive in the first place. The report notes, and it should be emphasized here, that quite frankly, it's very lucky on the part of Impact that there have been no positives up until now, because they've only been doing temperature checks and not actual COVID-19 testing. What I will say on that is the report notes that it was lucky that Impact hasn't had any positive tests. How would they even know? Because they're not running them. The only way they would know is if this wrestler had an outside test and made mention of it to Impact Wrestling, which again, is craziness. It's craziness. Another Impact talent noted how they felt Impact was being very irresponsible due to being, as I mentioned previously, the only major wrestling company not to be doing testing for the coronavirus at their tapings. And when I read this story, to be honest, we're in November, pretty much December. This is pandemic now. It's been going on, especially widespread since March, late February, early March. I am stunned. I am absolutely stunned that we are in December, nearly in December, and Impact Wrestling is not doing testing. And they have run shows, they have run television tapings, they have run live pay-per-views, they have run Impact Plus specific events. And for the entirety, for all of it, they have not been doing any testing. They've only been doing temperature checks. That is beyond irresponsible. That is beyond irresponsible. Considering that you can be completely asymptomatic, you can have no symptoms and you can still test positive for COVID-19. The temperature check deal is essentially worthless. Essentially worthless. That's what it is. It is essentially worthless because you can have no temperature, you can have no cough, you can have no loss of taste or smell or anything like that, and you can still test positive. Yes, you can have all of those symptoms. Yes, if you do come in and you have a high temperature, then maybe you get a test, then maybe you do test positive. But you can have a high temperature and test negative. You can have a low temperature and test positive too. So I am stunned. I am absolutely stunned. I think it's incredibly, incredibly irresponsible by Impact Wrestling. And I'm shocked. I'm shocked. Because I, like many fans, I think was under the assumption that Impact was being very thorough and doing thorough testing here. And it would appear that they haven't been at all. I assumed that when they were doing these empty arena shows during the pandemic, they were being like AEW and doing testing. I understand that maybe Impact Wrestling doesn't have the budget of a WWE, of an AEW, but you've got people like Ring of Honor, they're doing full-fledged testing. You've got people like MLW doing full-fledged testing. So Impact, what's your excuse? There is none. There is no excuse. Impact managed to stay open this whole time during the pandemic. They managed to do their TV shows, their pay-per-views, whatever. And I think like many fans thought it was because they were doing testing. And it hasn't. Now, obviously, we haven't heard any talent come out and criticize Impact because they're not doing any testing, because they're probably told they're not allowed to. Why would you do that? Why would you come out and say, oh, they're not doing testing? Because you get fired and you'd lose your job. And Lord knows you can't afford to lose your job in the current climate. And again, people will say, well, considering how crazy this is, it's lucky they haven't had a positive test. And it is lucky that they haven't had a positive test. I'm stunned. Not only am I stunned that they're not doing any testing, I'm stunned it's taken till this long for this report to come out that they're not doing any testing, and for them to be a positive test backstage at Impact. It's the only positive test we know about backstage at Impact. Who knows? And it's the only positive test they know about backstage. I mean, who knows? You could have had people in there that were completely asymptomatic, had no idea they had it. I've heard stories over here in the UK, we've seen them all in the press, of people that they get the COVID test and they say you tested negative, but on the antibody test, you had COVID at some point. Imagine that. Imagine that. That could absolutely be the case with Impact Wrestling backstage. They just wouldn't know because they weren't doing testing. This doesn't look good at all. It doesn't look good, and it isn't good at all when it comes to Impact Wrestling, and it's incredibly reckless, quite frankly, especially when you have organizations like MLW, like Ring of Honor, who did it the right way. They absolutely did it the right way. They went, you know what, this pandemic is out of control, it's crazy, we don't want to put our talent at risk, we don't want to put our fans at risk, we don't want to put our officials at risk, we don't want to put our talent's families at risk, we don't want to put anyone at risk, we don't want to be responsible for anyone getting sick, or heaven forbid, anyone getting deathly sick. We don't want to be part of that. So we'll go on hiatus. That's exactly what MLW did. That's exactly what Ring of Honor did. They went on hiatus and they returned only when they could do it safely and they could have proper testing procedures in place and health and safety procedures in place. And that's exactly what they've done. MLW's back up and running. Ring of Honor's back up and running. Now, Impact Wrestling, they've been running the whole time. I guess they thought they would have the jump on everyone else. Well, while they're on hiatus, we can rise. We can do great stuff, and potentially it did work for them for a while. But now you have this news about Impact, and you have these people going to these Impact tapings, the talent, the officials, the people working the cameras, people putting up the ring, whoever's at these tapings. You have these people going back to their families. You have people traveling from all over the United States. I don't think people sometimes realize how these things can spread so quickly. Because, again, you're going back to your families, and if you're flying into Nashville, right? If you're flying into Nashville, you could potentially pick it up at that taping and then infect a load of people as you go through the airport. You don't know. And I guess people will say, well, some people might drive because it's safer. Some people might. But then if they go into that taping and then they get it from someone that's infected, completely asymptomatic, they don't have a temperature, who knows? Who knows? It's so reckless, and this whole thing when it comes to testing, whatever, is because you're trying to control it. You're trying to control it, and you're trying to control what is very uncontrollable, and there are so many variables about. You're trying to minimize risk. And when you don't do testing, and when you have all of these people from all over the country come into one place, and from all different walks of, their families that come in from different walks of life, it's so reckless. It's so reckless. And I have praised Impact so much on this channel. I do daily videos about Impact Wrestling. I talk about them on multiple occasions every day. I do watch logs for all of their pay-per-views. I praise their storyline direction. I praise the programming they do. But you can't praise this. I was heavily critical of WWE over the summer for their sheer lack of testing in the spring and the summer. When it came to not doing any testing at the Performance Center, they were doing the same things. They were doing the just temperature checks, just medical questionnaires, and no mask wearing. I was heavily critical of that because they were a billion-dollar publicly traded company. In fairness to them, I felt that, despite them not doing it sooner, they absolutely should have done it sooner, but now they do have their act together. They have widespread testing. If you even need to get into the Amway Center in Orlando, you have to have a negative test the day before the show. There's social distancing and mandatory mask wearing. That's a massive improvement. It doesn't negate the fact that they should have done it earlier, but it's an improvement. And I guess the only out you could give them back in April or May is maybe they didn't know as much back then. Even that is a ludicrous response to that, to be honest with you. It's a ludicrous response to that, but you can kind of understand it, maybe. Impact Wrestling, what's your excuse? It's December. Everything we know about the situation with the pandemic right now, everything we know that the safest way is to have widespread testing, to have social distancing, mask wearing, hand sanitizing stations. I don't know if that's the case backstage, but the fact that you're not doing testing, it negates mask wearing, it negates having hand sanitizing, because you might have someone that's already infected in there. And you have to be critical of Impact for this. You have to. It's not right. It's not right. It's reckless and it's wrong. And Impact have to address this. Now, they've done all of their TV tapings for the remainder of the year heading into Hard to Kill. With this report coming out, I hope that people in Impact, whether it's the people at Anthem, whether it's the talent, whoever it needs to be, I hope somebody starts to put some pressure on them to say, you know what, this just isn't right. This just isn't right. And this is at a time as well when it comes to Impact. There are a ton of guys there that are coming to the end of their contract, whether it's Ethan Page, Taya Valkyrie, Sami Callihan, other names that are coming to the end of their contract and they're yet to re-sign. I know the backstage atmosphere at Impact is great, and there are a lot of people that really enjoy working there. And the atmosphere is very family-like, and it's not to say that just because they don't do testing, it's a bad environment, it's a bad place, or the talent isn't happy, because that isn't the case from what I hear. However, it does take for the talent or the people backstage to say, you know what, I want to stay with Impact, but I ain't signing the contract while it's unsafe. Because that's what it is. It's not safe. It's not safe. It's reckless and it's wrong. And Impact have to address this. By the time they come back to do their Hard to Kill pay-per-view, they have to address this. And all of this hard work they've done this year, Impact have had one of the best years, despite the pandemic, that they have had in a long time. Slammiversary was trending worldwide. When's the last time that happened with Impact Wrestling? It was trending number 1 in the United States. I think up to like number 3 worldwide. That is huge for a company like Impact Wrestling. You've had people sign like the Good Brothers. You had people like even EC3 return for a period of time. Eric Young's returned to the company. You had cameos from people like The Rock and Mick Foley and Bret Hart. And I know that was for Ken Shamrock's induction. Nevertheless, they have had a hugely successful year despite the circumstances. That could all disappear like that with bad PR because of just sheer neglect when it comes to the testing procedures there if this report is accurate. What if someone gets really sick? What if someone's family gets really sick? And I know some of the responses, I know some people that might watch this might not believe in the pandemic, which I think is ludicrous. And I know some people deny it and say, oh, the mortality rate is 99.9%. The fact of the matter is people have died of this. The facts are there, the figures are there. And yes, we have maybe a vaccine around the corner when it comes to next year. It doesn't negate the fact that this is incredibly reckless by Impact Wrestling. And I know people might use the excuse of, well, these wrestlers, they know what they're getting into. They know what they signed up for. What if the wrestler really doesn't have a choice? You have to remember, they're an independent contractor with no health benefits right now. In a time where money is down, their contracts in Impact Wrestling are surely much less than the contracts in WWE and AEW for the majority of the wrestlers. They can't take any indie dates because most of the indies have shut up shop because of the pandemic. And they can't tour because there are no fans. So at a time where they can't afford to stay at home, they can't afford to not go to the TV tapings and make some money. Because otherwise, where's that money going to come from? So many wrestlers we've seen this year saying that I've had a lot of money dry up and times are tough. Times are tough. And despite an unsafe environment, they have to go. They don't have a choice. It's a pandemic. Times are tough. Money's tight. And don't get me wrong, I really appreciate all the entertainment that Impact Wrestling has provided us this year throughout the pandemic. But it's not right. This isn't March or April anymore. We know so much about testing, about the pandemic, about what you have to do to put on a safe show. And it's totally not acceptable to have no testing at the tapings at this point. It isn't. Widespread testing is there. It's available. It's available for MLW. It's available for Ring of Honor. It's available for WWE and AEW. Why isn't Impact Wrestling do it? It's a massive question that needs to be answered and asked. And I don't think this will go away. Because at this point, what is the difference between Impact Wrestling and an indie show? We've heard those reports over the summer when they were doing those outside independent wrestling shows, and there wasn't testing there, there was temperature checks there, and there were outbreaks. There were outbreaks there, but people basically said, look, it's an independent show, they might not be able to afford the testing, and you know what you're getting yourself into there. You had people like AEW who basically said, look, for the people on AEW Dark that might work independent shows, if you go to those independent shows and you go to a place where you might be potentially exposed to it, we're not bringing you in. At this point, what's the difference between Impact and these indie shows? There isn't. There isn't any difference because there's no testing. And bear in mind, in addition, some guys from Impact Wrestling have been at these indie shows where there's been outbreaks, and then they've gone to TV tapings. They might not have caught anything because there's no testing. So who knows how many people could have potentially been the virus transmitted to? You don't know. You don't know. And as someone who covers Impact so much here on the channel, it's really, really disappointing to hear. It's really disappointing to hear. Now, of course, we'll continue to monitor the story. If there's more that comes out about this, if Impact do a statement, a rebuttal. Again, this is all according to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, but it has been picked up by the likes of Fightful, Wrestling Inc., who are, of course, very reputable as well, and they will, of course, check with their sources in Impact Wrestling. So I'm sure this isn't the last we've heard about this. As I mentioned, it's incredibly disappointing, but we'll have to wait and see what Impact have to say on the matter. But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on these positive tests at the recent Impact Wrestling tapings and the Impact talent being not happy about the lack of testing provided by Impact Wrestling? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys and chatting about Impact Wrestling here on the channel. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button as well. It really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if you haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.